The Battle of McAllen / Lower Rio Grande Valley continued. In the first hour of the invasion, as the troops crossed the river under their heavy artillery support from the 19th Artillery Division's battalions of PHL-81 122mm multiple rocket launchers, their PLL-01 155mm towed artillery pieces, and PLL-66 152mm towed pieces within their specialized battalions, as well as the PHL-03 two battalions of 300mm rockets wrought havoc against the battlefield, along with air support from a single MiG-25 squadron tasked out to just this specific area of battle. The first units to fall prey were the 136th MP Battalion, one of the only few infantry-like combat-capable forces available to the Americans within just this sector, along with their artillery support coming from the 136th Maneuver Brigade's own 4th of the 133rd Field Artillery Regiment, 4th Battalion, which was right here, being hit by 300mm rockets at the edge of their range, along with Su-25 ground attack aircraft, along with civilians and the city of McAllen and surrounding areas themselves being hit by artillery as well. Where we left off at the Battle of the Fobs of the 136th MP Battalion, the snipers had taken out sentries quietly as they'd been dropped off by their headquarters company, which was responsible for driving all of the battalion's vehicles and dropping off the troops near their drop zones for their missions, as well as their heavy weapons company, part of which was on top of this hill. These lines, brown lines, symbolizing changes in elevation, and these brown areas here symbolize forest-type areas or woodlands, this being a woodland of scrub brush, mesquite wood trees, and some hardwood trees in this area that they snuck around the top to. This line symbolized a barbed wire and concertina wire fence, and this berm right here symbolized a earthen berm topped with barbed wire and concertina wire strands as fortifications to protect against small arms fire, although they did very little in this case, as they were attacked by heavy weapons such as mortars, loitering munitions such as the CH-901s with their heat warheads or high explosive anti-tank warheads, as well as FPV drones which delivered death from above, quadcopter drones that dropped explosives literally on the tops of vehicles or groupings of troops, as well as the heavy artillery being called in from howitzers, these symbolizing howitzer blasts. These lines of tents here were hit by mortars and later to be hit by artillery shortly thereafter. Showing this excerpt, these mean artillery strikes where the circles and X's are. These guard towers are hit by loitering munitions. This Su-25 coming in and hitting this patrolling group of 2 platoons of MPs in their MRAPs. These symbolize MRAPs. Regular circles symbolize just plain old trucks like your LMTVs or maybe your HETs, any type of standard military trucks. The ones with the lines, with the weaponry, symbolizes an MRAP. As the troops bounded and covered into position, supporting each other, leapfrogging to close the L as their giant closing L formation of a kill box, the artillery came in and swiftly blew the remains of what was left of the 136th MP away, including additional fobs off of this 2x4 mile map here, as they had others for other companies of their battalion. These were 2 battalions. Even at the opening of the battle, there was heavy destruction as 300mm rockets were on a counter-artillery mission or a suppression of enemy artillery operation and destroyed 2 batteries, leaving only 1 to flee. The first battery was completely obliterated by a giant area covered by 300mm rockets coming from the PHL-03 battalions, the 2 of which in the 19th Artillery Division of the 16th PLA Group Army. Farmhouses and ranches were destroyed, as the rubble indicates. and the pre-prepared firing positions of earthen berms were completely obliterated by laser-guided munitions being dropped by the Su-25s, as well as strafing attacks, and of course the 300mm rocket and loitering munition attacks fired by local MSS intelligence operatives, as indicated in the last video of this series. Having to relocate, they were only able to fire one more volley before finally being completely destroyed by being surrounded by troops of the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade, as well as being hit by another sortie of air power. Going back to the map, as stated in the previous video, we now go to the 4th Armored Division, busy clearing the flanks, as many of their battalions crossed at suitable crossing points, such as key bridges that were captured intact upon their own divisional artillery having smashed border posts and any type of resistance points that their ISR systems relayed the intel back for, as to ascertain specific targets for destruction. As the battalions crossed into Brownsville, with an additional 2 tasked out to clearing the international airport for later use as a FOB, and as well to destroy American military forces that were using it as a temporary logistical /ISR base before the war broke out, an additional battalion, closer to Padre Island, was able to ford the river at a fairly narrow and shallow crossing point, and it was tasked with dealing with the armed civilians. But even as that was occurring, fighting broke out in Brownsville itself, now heavily battered by all the different artillery types, especially the howitzers and the 122mm rockets, raining a steady barrage of destruction upon it. We go now to the battle at the Padre Island International Airport. This was the Battle of the Padre Island International Airport. Simultaneously, as the rocket and howitzer barrage was beginning, 2 battalions of armored battalions belonging to the 4th Armored Division had crossed bridges in the Brownsville area and began to capture rapidly the city, while elements of one of the 2 different armored battalions, being one Mechanized Infantry Company and one tank company, with support from CH-901 loitering munitions fired by the brigade's headquarters battalion, being armed with fragmentation warheads, and submarine-fired YJ-18B cruise missiles, as well as even Kalibr cruise missiles fired by the Kalibr-M battalion, operating TEL-based systems from Mexico, belonging to the Russian 125th Coastal Defense Brigade, which was then currently stationed there, totally engaging and smashing an unprepared force of 2 different American reserve companies and one Air National Guard wing numbering 380 troops total, who'd been deployed to the Padre Island International Airport in support of previous border operations, as well as to establish a logistical center for other local forces, in addition to an ISR base, thereby hosting the 461st Transportation Detachment, a company-sized unit, and the 961st Quartermaster Company, as well as the 111th Attack Squadron, which was an ISR and strike element operating both reconnaissance planes of the RC-26B varieties and also attack drones in the form of MQ-9 Reapers. Separately was a detachment of different warrant officers and enlisted men of the 19 Golf MOS operating an AN MQP-64 radar, in addition to having requisitioned the airport's radar itself, paying the air traffic controllers to continue working in a national security capacity now that civil aviation was essentially grounded due to economic reasons, but not the least of which being the mounting international tensions, as the combination of people not being able to afford to fly really hurt the airlines and caused them to have far fewer flights due to economic woes. And also, there was the tensions between America and Russia and China and their bloc of nations, all culminating in very many unused airports, which were desperate for money and were often leased by the government for placement of different forces in strategic areas, such as these border airports. Within this map, the Chinese PLA mechanized company belonging to one of the two armored battalions had struck rapidly from Brownsville and headed to the southeast upon penetrating the city with the rest of the two other battalions, this belonging to one of the two battalions, as well as the tank company, which had swung around from just to the south of the airport before driving up the runway after smashing through the airport perimeter fencing and traversing the berms found at many airports as part of the boundary. Stationed here was the 111th Attack Wing of the Air National Guard, of the Texas Air National Guard, as well as the 961st Quartermaster Company and the 461st Transportation Detachment, which was a company itself. The latter two mentioned were, of course, Army Reserve units. Here we have the radar mentioned, the AN/MQP-64 radar, and its command building, a portable command structure, and it had a berm constructed around it for protection from potential small arms attacks, and there were 2 machine gun nests dug in order to offer it simple protection. This yellow signifies the main runway. There's the other part of it. This particular map is a 2 by 1 mile map. So all these forces here, this is the buildings right here, roads. There are forces inside the building, and if there's a red box around it, that means that these infantry forces went in and they were attacked from inside the building. If you see the green around the arrow movements right here, these are some of their armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. They're Type-63 APCs with 12.7 millimeter machine gun turrets, which were manned by troops of their squadrons, and as well as their ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles with their 100 millimeter main cannons, as well as a 30 millimeter autocannon and a 7.62 millimeter coax in the turret, as well as 2 HJ-08 anti-tank missiles also on the side of the turret for additional protection against enemy armored units. There were also forces on top of the buildings, but they were eliminated by CH-109 loitering munitions. As they were sighted, they were immediately hit and were not given the chance to fire from above, as this one came in and hit this grouping of troops right here, all surrounded by red, means they were eliminated. These troops did come under fire as they tried to enter the airport building, but they quickly went from room to room, area to area, waiting room to waiting room, and engaged in vicious combat with 40 defenders inside the main building alone, the main terminal building. Outside, as the attack began and got underway, there were 2 attempts to get drones into the air, even though now that satellites had been eliminated, the American satellites, There was only a ground controller signal, which meant that the drones would have had to have stayed low flying, but this too was interrupted by electronic warfare systems that jammed the signal and caused one to freeze on the runway, and one that was taking off that was about to crash anyway was taken out by HQ-7P or 7B air defense missiles, which are shorter range. And of course, you have these YJ-18B submarine launched cruise missiles coming in and hitting their targets, eliminating the radar and its portable control center, eliminating targets back on the terminal area that were sitting out in the flight area where the aircraft would normally come in and load passengers. These were turned into campsites for the different units, as well as the Russian Kalibr-M cruise missiles hitting the Texas Air National Guard 111th Attack Wing right here, as well as forces busily storming the buildings, even as loitering munitions and cruise missiles were hitting outside and blasting everything into oblivion. Most of the actual force-on-force combat occurred within the buildings themselves, although due to the relative protection of being dug underground to a degree where, they had to stick their heads up out of it, there were a few troops that survived the nearby blast of the missile hitting the radar station, partly due to there being a berm around it at the time it was hit. So that muffled some of the blast radiuses. Blast radiuses, even from a roughly 800 HE, high explosive tipped cruise missile, can cause a relatively large blast radius, including a crater as well. So the blast radius can be as wide as 500 meters with that type of a warhead. So most of the damage, of course, is going to cause a roughly 50-meter crater, which is almost half of a football field, with everything else going out from the radius from the impact getting a little bit weaker and weaker. But there were troops that survived due to keeping their heads low, and they attempted to fire against the tanks, but the coax machine guns of the tanks lit them up and eliminated them, and they essentially did nothing. And these troops were not armed adequately with anti-tank weapons to begin with, so they really stood no chance against heavy armor. Although the infantry-on-infantry fighting did produce some Chicom wounded, but there was only one KIA on the Chicom side, and it was nearly all American KIAs due to the intensive loitering munition attacks, as you can see right here, hitting their motor pools, hitting their tents. There were a lot of soldiers outside that were hit, as you can see, hitting their portable buildings, whether these were portable command buildings or the portable shower buildings that you often see on American FOBs overseas. They were constructed here as well, bathroom and shower facilities, portable command centers, tents for living spaces, up-armored Humvee, machine gun mounted. You've got all these trucks in the motor pool, troops trying to run inside, getting blasted as the loitering munitions and missiles hit. These loitering munitions were armed with HE warheads. Same was done here. Essentially, just over 3 companies worth of men were utterly slaughtered. MRAP right here on guard, more portable buildings, more tents, and more loitering munitions, as well as cruise missiles. These were the air defense missiles coming in to swat at the drone that just barely made it off the runway that was about to go down anyway, as the electronic warfare systems of the different group armies were beginning to jam the signals. This is one of the RC-26B aircraft right here. Of course, there were more drones and another aircraft off the map, but these were all hit by Russian Kalibrs coming in from Mexico, and these were hit by Chinese cruise missiles coming in, their YJ-18Bs that were shot from their Type-39A Song-class submarines that were off in the Gulf. And these were more terminal buildings. You did have some firefighting by the fence initially until the cruise missiles and the loitering munitions impacted, but these troops here did take some fire. No casualties, though. This is their headquarters platoon back here. their vehicles are in a wagon circle. Their fueler, an MVP M34 fueler right here, and their Type 84 recovery vehicle of the headquarters. 2 of their VP-11 MRAPs with heavy machine guns mounted, and of course they had their Shangji trucks, or sometimes Dongfeng trucks. They had several different types of trucks that their PLA operates. That's just their headquarters platoon of this Mechanized Infantry Company right here that's assaulting from this side. They went straight for the air traffic control tower as well that was right here. As you can see, there's red here, which means it took some blast damage, as did this building, due to all the loitering munitions and cruise missiles coming in and tank shells that were even fired as the tank company rolled in. As you can see, initially, after they smashed the fences, one tank platoon peeled off to provide security so that the other 3 platoons of their tank company, leaving their headquarters platoon behind for safety reasons, plowed ahead to cut off any sort of escape, if it was even possible for them to escape, because they did have forces out patrolling the other parts of the perimeter, like right here. This was a patrolling unit that was obliterated by fire from the tanks, such as an HE Frag T shell and some small arms fire from the turret gunners firing their 12.7 millimeter machine guns, or their 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax guns, which of course are right next to the main gun on the tank turret. And they proceeded to drive and spread out all the way across the airport, ambushing and wiping out another patrol along the way, cutting off any chance of escape from anybody still alive inside the buildings or someone who miraculously survived the attack out here. Parking areas, road, another parking area, more terminals. The brown is trees and grass. And this particular battle here lasted only a matter of minutes. It ended almost as quickly as it began, as the combination of missile strikes, electronic warfare jamming locally, as well as loitering munitions, which there were an ample handful of them, all airborne at the time, as well as the heavy armor and the heavy mechanized infantry forces coming in to clean house, as it were. Going back to the main map, this excerpt was occurring right here at the airport battle itself. Combined, the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade and 16th Spec Ops Battalion, these forces here being the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade and 16th Group Army Spec Ops Battalion, who all crossed and engaged and destroyed armed civilian pockets, as well as the 136th MP Battalion as some of their first moves within the first hour of the battle. They would continue moving north along the western flank as going up this way in a general direction, moving west and north. As the 46th Mechanized Infantry Battalion moved up Route 281 from McAllen and up the center of the battle space, which was the 46th right here along the river. As mentioned in the last video, these battalions all comprise the 46th Mechanized Infantry Division. So they all went up the center, gradually clearing Route 281, leaving the 4th Armored Division to clear the eastern flank of the 16th Group Army of all enemy resistance. As this was unfolding, the 19th Artillery Division, 18th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and 16th Group Army Independent Headquarters Battalion, which encapsulated the command of the entire Group Army, which was right there, with the air defense and artillery forces hanging back, all prepared to cross the border, with the other group armies moving into position behind them to prepare to follow behind the 16th Group Army, spearheading this particular invasion prong. By hour 4 of the invasion, McAllen, Texas, and surrounding area had been cleared of all resistance to the west. The 136th MP Battalion and hundreds of armed civilians had all been crushed, with a battle looming against the 1,200 armed civilians of the local militia forces, as had been discovered by intelligence on the area, being these forces here. That would be a battle that would be occurring very soon as the 5th Anti-Tank and 16th Special Operations continued on their move north. Also, there was the clearance of Edinburgh, Texas, of all resistance, which Edinburgh being a small town right here, as well as a textile plant surrounding cotton farms directly north of Harlington, Texas. This being this group right here. This, near the 4th Armored Division's main route of advance, being this route right here, there was one battalion which would be tasked with crushing this particular pocket of just over 400 armed civilians from the local area. First came the latter as far as it relates to the textile plant by hour 4.5 into the invasion. Intel reports were relayed to the Armored Battalion assigned to this area near the coast, and itself was directed through this specific zone en route back to rejoin the rest of the division. Said intelligence advised of a cluster of armed civilians emerging from individual homes and farms all throughout a 5 by 5 mile area, some nearly 400 or slightly more as per the count acquired by the analysts monitoring the drone feed, and AI program also aiding in the processing of multiple unfolding situations, all happening in just this one small region, not to mention literal thousands of other zones elsewhere going on throughout the invasion as well. There was a focal point of the civilian activity being a grouping of large cotton farms surrounding a textile factory. Due to the geography and relatively flat topography of the coastal plain in this sector of the region, the armored forces could use their vehicles to maximum advantage, able to fully take advantage of certain formations of vehicles that urban combat or rough terrain often prohibited. This battalion was traveling in a diamond or rolling arrow shape, a form of armored phalanx that allowed for all manner of possible maneuvering, such as so, where you would have an armored company here, a mechanized infantry company here, a whole mechanized infantry company here, another armored company there, another armored company there, your headquarters company, which is typically the lightest of all in terms of vehicles and their protection, right here. And then you could have your anti-tank company and another armored company back here, or you could have it arranged this way to where it's more like a diamond. And what they can do is if you're coming up on an area, these forces leading the way can peel off to take this area while these forces go all the way around just like that and encapsulate the area. Or if you want to do an even bigger area, these forces can go here and these can go out even further and link up around it. Or they could serve, if you're doing a smaller area and these guys spread out and surround an area, these guys can cover the flanks of the guys that are covering the fighting in the middle while these guys go up the middle. And these guys in the back can act as like a reserve force, where the anti-tank company that's back here off the map can fire its long-range anti-tank missiles and hit targets ahead of these advancing forces to provide them longer-range fire support. And the other armored battalion can act as a armored reserve force, which you can commit them into battle anytime. And they can just surround the headquarters company and provide like a cocoon of armored protection, while these other forces surround and eliminate a whole area. As well as using their advantage and in their available weaponry to the fullest possible range and capabilities, such as the 125mm main tank guns, 100mm cannons and 30mm autocannons of the infantry fighting vehicles, and anti-tank missiles and crew serve weapons on the individual armor personnel carriers or anti-tank vehicles, as it related to the anti-tank missiles and the crew serve weapons on armor personnel carriers. And as armed civilians tried to use irrigation drainage ditches as makeshift fighting positions, as well as barns and local homes, even also the textile plant. All these places seeing themselves relentlessly shelled and missiled with HE fragmentation shells, high explosive anti-tank or heat shells, and anti-tank missiles such as the HJ-10s, a very potent and long-range anti-tank missile system. Also, the use of 30mm autocannon blasting or armor-piercing ammunition, depending on if they were loaded for anti-personnel or anti-vehicle operations, 100mm HE shells, and an array of coax and crew serve machine guns, ranging from the very powerful 14.5mm heavy machine gun to the 12.7mm heavy machine gun, which the 14.5 was only on some vehicles, or the 12.7 by 54mm machine guns that were also sometimes used as a coax or a turret machine gun on armor personnel carriers. Unimpeded maneuvering meant that the battalion's companies that comprised it were able to spread out and envelop, then saturate a large area with munitions before reforming again into their diamond or rolling arrow formation prior to rejoining the rest of the division after reaching them upon their route, as shown on the larger map. By hour 5, the vast majority of the 46th Mechanized Division was about to pass through to the Edinburgh area, some nearly 20 miles due north of McAllen, Texas. And while that was occurring, this armored battalion, clearing the easternmost flanks, as shown on the map right here, this was where they encountered the 400 armed civilians, each of these being roughly 200 each. They encapsulated them, surrounded them, and saturated the area with 125mm tank shells and HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, as well as an array of 100mm fire, 30mm autocannon fire, and of course small arms fire from the crew serve weapons. And we go back to that battle. Upon receiving the intel on where all these civilians were, they had already begun to corral them into a kill box by destroying everything in their way, such as these farm buildings and houses along this road, leaving some intact, at least whenever there wasn't any type of resistance, and they found no need to fire upon it. This one was immediately taking fire, as all these forces had been advised that drones, such as the orbiting WZ-7 recon drone that had a wide ability to see huge swathes of the battlefield, had seen them try to take cover in a barn, which was promptly destroyed along with the house, shed, and other barn before these forces went around this large area. And this company right here began to assemble itself for an attack. These civilians in the drainage ditch were totally wiped out by coax machine guns, 12.7 millimeter, some 14.5 millimeter, as well as fragmentation tank shells that were lobbed into the area, and upon blasting through shrapnel in all directions, shredding those in the trenches to bits. Of course, you have your civilians, armed, reactionary, running across the field. You do have some CH-901 loitering munitions armed with HE shells that were fired by the Armored Battalion's headquarters company. And on this hilltop, you have civilians running. This was the textile plant. You have an ample number trying to run and take cover within it, as well as some trying to run further out to take some cover behind these rolling hills or to get into the irrigation canal here. Well, what had occurred was the headquarters platoon of this company right here, being led by this platoon of 5 tanks, that they peeled off, went into a defensive star formation, and this platoon went here, broke into 5 individual tanks here. This platoon went here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tanks there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, after leveling these buildings. And they all began to levy heavy firepower upon the area. As you can see, these arrows are completely surrounded, and even groupings of troops were destroyed immediately upon the time this map was shown. As the map is being shown, they were being eliminated immediately, with those still alive running this direction being wiped out as the arrows indicate. The loitering munitions, of course, hit others that are off the map running into this large area. Meanwhile, all the while, as this is occurring, all these companies are peeling off the whole battalion. They're peeling off to surround the whole area where they link up and also vector their fire properly so that there's no friendly fire, as this company right here in the center begins peeling off into a straight line to advance and clear the area and destroy everything in its wake with their AFT-10, HJ-10 anti-tank missile launchers over a mile away, firing into the groupings of armed civilians up here and into these buildings, literally obliterating everything. They're very big, very powerful and long-range anti-tank missiles. So as you can see, it was a mass slaughter. And upon clearing the area, as this force would go up through the middle, they would reform with these other battalions, reforming up and all coming back together and getting into their diamond, along with the forces that were here, the headquarters company, the headquarters platoon of this company here, all getting back into formation and rolling up this road here right behind them and right across the fields after them. Right before linking back up with their rest of their division. Now, this was only 1 battalion, so a company is normally over 100 men strong. These vehicles were the armored companies had more tanks because there's less crew members in a tank, and that's just the way they do it in China. Ours have usually 4. They usually have like 20 tank sized companies. We have usually like around 14 because usually there's a headquarters platoon that has 2 tanks, like a command tank. China has a little bit different. They use armored vehicles like MRAPs and sometimes armored personnel carriers as their command vehicles, but they have 4 platoons of 5 tanks, so they're pretty large in size. These tanks are Type-88Cs, which are among some of China's best tanks. Now, their very best tank is the Type-99A. That thing is extremely advanced, very new, very capable, and very strong. The armor on it's incredible. It's a tungsten steel alloy, very, very strong armor. And the Type-96B is their second best tank. And then the Type-88C, it's still an extremely capable tank, very lethal, but it's like their third best tank if you had to put them in order as far as their technology they employ, their capabilities, and their protection. But the Type-88C does have very good fire control systems and has that very devastating 125 millimeter gun that has quite a reach to it, over a 4-kilometer reach. So, it's a very dangerous, destructive weapon. The Type-96B and 99A, though, are very extremely advanced battle tanks when one looks into all the specifications of them. The Type-88C is still very, very potent tank. There's also a Type-85M, which is essentially a Type-88C. They're pretty much the same thing, but that's as far as like their specifications, their turret design, everything. Going back to the main map, after that battle concluded, they went and linked up with the rest of their division, which had crossed here in Brownsville, went through Harrington and destroyed all resistance there, cleared off some civilian resistance here, while this battalion that had went off crossing here and took care of all these armed civilian clusters here, re-linked up together and headed north as they had virtually cleared the whole entire western flank of any sort of enemy resistance whatsoever to make it completely safe for all the group armies to cross. While that was happening, all of these things were happening simultaneously, from all the activities going on over on the western flank to the eastern flank to right up the center, going through McAllen itself, up to Edinburgh and beyond. We will explore the rest of the battle in the next video as we go into the battle that occurred in Edinburgh between subunits of the 46th Mechanized Infantry Division and a cluster of just over 400 armed civilians, before moving on to the rest of the battle, where the forces of the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade and the 16th Group Army Special Operations Battalion encountered a fairly moderately sized force of organized armed civilian militia in their specific normal AO insofar as it relates to the militia forces.